All right, we've got a packed agenda here, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those of you who are joining us from Hawaii or Alaska. And just again, really want to welcome everyone to today's town hall. Again, if you're waiting, please go ahead and put your email in so that we can account for your attendance if you are joining by phone. And again, if you are needing closed captioning, make sure you turn that on. It's a feature on your Zoom application. So just want to welcome everyone to today's town hall. This is our 8th virtual national town hall on helping the helpers, addressing needs of first responders following a mass violence incident. Okay, a couple of things I just want to highlight for you. We have just are in the process of undergoing a name change. So our new name is going to be the National Mass Violence Center. And our tagline is providing resources to victims, survivors, and those who serve them. And our new name and tagline was effective as of October 11th. It was really just a way to shorten our name and make it a little bit easier for everyone to remember. And of course, none of the work that we do would be possible without the generous support we've had from the U.S. Department of Justice and Office for Victims of Crime. So just as a welcome here, I just want to let everyone know that, first of all, we have over 400 participants who registered. That represents 41 states, including DC, and 7 countries outside of the United States. Our top professions are victim service professionals and mental behavioral health professionals. About 2/3 of you are from a community that has experienced a mass violence incident, and about 2/3 indicated that you have responded to a mass violence incident in a professional capacity. Today's town hall is focusing on helping the helpers. How can we provide support and resources to those who respond immediately after a mass violence incident? Before we get started, can we please take a moment to pause and acknowledge the most recent mass violence incident in Lewiston, Maine on October 25th, as well as the 2-year observance of the mass shooting in Oxford High School in Michigan. Sadly, mass violence incidents just occur far too frequently. They happen in urban areas, rural areas, in public and private locations, in places of worship, in schools, and other public venues. And sadly, no community is immune to these types of horrific events. And that's all the more reason we need to be prepared and to help prepare professionals and communities so that everyone understands the impact of a collective trauma like a mass violence incident, and that also we all recognize the best practices in preparedness, response, and recovery so that we can truly provide trauma-informed care to all of those who are impacted, with a special focus today on first responders. A couple of housekeeping announcements. As was mentioned in the chat, we are recording today's town hall. And after being posted to our website, the recording, slide deck, and resources will all be available. Just go straight to our website at mvvrc.org. Again, if you're joining us by phone, here's the email to give us your name and email address so that we can provide credit to you for attending. And I want to thank everyone who took the time to send some questions into our presenters in advance, and that will help us to be able to do the best job we can to answer questions at the end of today's presentation. So here's today's learning objectives. Number 1, we want to describe the personal and professional perspectives of a police chief who responded to a mass violence incident, as well as lessons learned. Second, to describe the personal perspective of a career-long first responder whose lived experience includes the murder of his mother in a hate-motivated mass violence incident. We want to identify the scope of immediate, short, and long-term supportive services to help first responders strengthen their personal resilience in the aftermath of a mass violence incident. And last, to describe the most important skills and strategies that are needed for first responders. I'd like to go ahead and introduce today's speakers. First, we have Dr. Angie Moreland. Angie is a clinical psychologist and co-director of the NMVC. She's also an associate professor at the Medical University of South Carolina. Angie also serves as the director of the Preparedness Division of the NMVC. And Angie is going to share with us immediate and short-term strategies to support first responders and build resilience in the aftermath of a mass violence incident. Next, we have Garnell Whitfield Jr., who is a retired City of Buffalo Commissioner of Fire and a member of our center's Survivors and Providers Steering Committee. He'll share his perspective as a career-long first responder whose lived experience includes the murder of his mother in a hate-motivated mass violence incident in Buffalo, New York on May 14th, 2022. Chief Greg Mullen is Chief of Police and Associate Vice President of Public Safety at Clemson University. Chief Mullen will provide a personal and professional perspective as a career-long first responder who has responded to mass violence incidents, including Mother Emanuel Church here in Charleston in 2015. And last but certainly not least, we have Mary Fetchett, who is the Executive Director and President of Voices Center for Resilience, which she co-founded following the murder of her son Brad in the terrorist attacks of 9/11 in New York City. We're also fortunate to have Mary serve on our center's Survivor and Provider Steering Committee. Mary will focus on the long-term needs of and strategies for first responders. After our presentations, we will highlight the most important skills and strategies for first responders and provide you with several take-home messages and lessons learned. We're also planning some time for questions and answers at the end of our town hall. And I also want to make sure that I introduce Eugenia Pedley from the Office of Victims of Crime. She is a Senior Program Manager and the Program Officer for our award. So Eugenia, I'm turning it over to you.
Thanks so much, Michelle, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad you can join us today. As Michelle said, I'm Eugenia, and I manage the Mass Violence Program at OVC. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, in 1984, Congress established the Office for Victims of Crime under the U.S. Department of Justice through an amendment to the Victims of Crime Act known as VOCA. One element of OVC's mission is to plan for and respond to mass violence and terrorism events. I think today's topic is a vital one, though it's often overlooked. Following a mass violence event, many people don't think about first responders except for their operational role, and this is unfortunate. While it's completely appropriate for much of the focus to be on victims who were targeted by a perpetrator, they are not the only ones affected by the incident. Under our Anti-Terrorism and Emergency Assistance Program, or AEAP grants, those who respond to an incident are also considered victims, even if they don't view themselves through that lens. Responders can be subject to gunfire and other hazards. They also witness the crime scene and engage with devastated victims. Even with training, these are intense and traumatic events. We also consider families of responders to be indirect victims because of their close association with responders. Through our grants, we also support services for other helpers, such as medical personnel who work to save victims, medical examiner staff, 911 operators, victim service providers, and a host of others who work closely with direct victims. We want to be sure we're providing services for all these people and their loved ones. For those listening today, I want all of you who are first responders in the broadest sense to know that you are appreciated. The work you do is special, and we will do our very best to support you. Thank you, and now I'll turn it back over to Rochelle.
Thank you, Eugenia. I'm going to go ahead and introduce again Dr. Angie Moreland Johnson, who's going to start us off today.
Good afternoon or morning, everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit this morning about, or this afternoon, about first responders and some of the impacts that we first have before I turn it over to my colleagues to talk a little bit more about their personal impact and some resources. So when we think about a mass violence incident or after a mass violence incident occurs, there's a lot of victims that are present. And I'm sure this isn't a comprehensive list, but some of the victims that we think about are listed here and kind of encompass people that were directly present at the event, people who maybe knew someone present at the event, and also really the entire community, and it touches on everyone that's involved. As Eugenia said a second ago, we often do forget about our first responders. So I want to point out kind of the third bullet here is that our firefighters, law enforcement, EMS, dispatchers, and other officials, we do consider victims, and they're pieces that I will talk about, and also some of my colleagues today will talk about, that they don't always consider themselves victims, but we very much do. And I think I'm very glad that today we're focusing on this today in order to make sure that we highlight that. Next slide. One more. So when we think about the mental health impact of mass violence incidents overall, and this is for everybody, there's a lot of different impact that can happen on both individuals and on the community. A lot of the mental health pieces that we hear about are post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. So these can include, symptoms of intrusion, avoidance, alteration in arousal, depression, general anxiety, fears, anger, and decreased personal safety. So a lot of this impact can happen to those, but in reality, most victims will not experience significant mental health concerns. So they will experience some very significant impact directly after, but that may not translate into mental health concerns. Now, where we do find that the increased risk comes is when cumulative trauma is there. So when we look at data and when we kind of look just clinically and working with the mass violence incidents that we have worked with in the past, people who have experienced prior trauma and people who have experienced prior stress are those people that are more likely to have a lot of that mental health impact, and it does tend to translate into more significant concerns. So when we think about first responders, that cumulative trauma is the big piece that is there. So when we look at when we look at first responders in general and outside of mass violence incidents, we find that first responders do have higher rates of PTSD and depression in general. So you can see the rates here of PTSD are much higher than in the general population, which tends to run around 4 to 6%. Also in depression, suicide, and that comes with suicidal ideations and suicidal plans and attempts. Those higher rates of PTSD and depression in the first place with first responders then tend to create more of that cumulative trauma, and it does very highly increase the mental health capacity or mental health impact that it can have on first responders after mass violence. First responders also do have these unique professional experiences. So in a lot of other job duties, they don't have to worry about, other jobs don't typically have to worry about death notification, personal exposure or injury, professional colleagues being hurt or killed, that depersonalization that comes along with being able to cope and do their job. However, it serves as that mechanism, but also can have some pretty intense impact. And then also the unique sensory flashbacks that come along with first responders, just everyday job duties. So when we talk about this mass violence impact, looking at that landscape of where first responders tend to have much more unique professional experiences and personal experiences, and also have higher rates of mental health, that's where we really want to focus in and figure out, so what's happening following a mass violence incident? We know that cumulative trauma is present. We know that they are, at least how we see it, as victims. They're the first responders. They're the first people on the scene of these events. And as was pointed out earlier, we typically think about their actual duties and what's happening in their response to the event, but we don't always think about their mental health and the long-term impact that we can have. So one piece that we did as part of our center, and I'm going to highlight some of this background this morning, is we went into 4 different communities that had experienced mass violence incidents. And this was in 2018 that we went into these communities. And we've continued working with multiple first responders since then. And a lot of the feedback that we're hearing is very, very similar. So we invited first responders who were directly involved in these 4 events. So in Aurora, Boston, Annapolis, and Washington, D.C. as a part of their mass violence incidents. And I'm going to highlight a few things that they said today, kind of in the impact or kind of in the setting of the planning, the response, and the resiliency that we hear afterwards. And that will hopefully set the stage for some of what we'll hear about in a little bit, and also for what we can do to respond and help first responders. So when we first went in, I mentioned these phases. When I first went in to do these focus groups, we did not plan to hear back from them according to these particular phases. So we went in, talked with first responders, and really just wanted to hear, what are you finding? And it did tend to go very much in these phases. And anyone who's worked with our center in other capacities has seen these phases and know that we tend to fall to work with victims among these phases. So it's very appropriate that the first responders talked about this as well. So in terms of planning, to start out with, what we heard is very, very loudly is the importance of planning. So almost every single first responder, and I know Chief Mullen and a couple of my other speakers today will talk about this, have really, really talked about the importance of having these relationships ahead of time, having joint trainings ahead of time, and really having this background and experience with other communities that have experienced mass violence, to be able to plan and prepare for a potential incident. So you can see a couple of these quotes here and read them. Go ahead to the next slide. Moving into response, because I want to make sure we talk about this today, is when we talk about response in general. So when we talk about, for communities, what we hear about response is we hear about a major need for rapid, broad, immediate help. We need to triage needs. We need to provide timely and reliable information, provide self-help resources, and then provide psychological first aid, which we'll talk about in a second. So how does this apply to first responders? Pretty much exactly lays on to what's needed there as well. The issue with that, though, is many of our first responders, what they'll say is, this response was part of my job. I was doing my job. I responded to the scene. I did what I needed to do to keep people safe, but they don't necessarily take into effect, we don't always take into effect that those mental health needs and those response needs are the same for first responders, or similar as they are for other victims that are there. And that's what we heard a lot of times. So we heard about, in response, what was most helpful for first responders, of course, was making sure the scene was safe, making sure they contained threat. But then even louder, what we heard was that collaboration and working together, that information sharing and communication, and focusing on both victim and survivor needs and also first responder needs were very much necessary. And I really like this quote. You can read through it, that most of the active shooter events historically are done with, the threat is eliminated within 10 minutes. Everyone thinks that that's the end of the event. Well, it isn't. What happens to the people after they're evacuated, and what happens to the first responders? And I really like that last piece, because as we talked about, that's not always thought about. A lot of people ask about debriefing and kind of what is recommended in debriefing. And it's very important to recognize and to point out that there is a big difference between tactical debriefing and psychological debriefing. And a lot of times we talk about these, or most of the time, as in one piece. So people will say, well, debriefing is a good thing, or debriefing has to occur. And it's important to really recognize there are a difference between those two things. So one high recommendation that we have is that early intervention should be offered to those affected by a potentially traumatic event. We know that it should be offered in an individual or a group setting, but then also really focusing on how to do that psychological debriefing. The tactical debriefing is done as part of the response and as part of the job duty. Critical incident stress debriefing, or CISD, and then more recently called CISM, has been commonly used, but it's really important to point out that the evidence for the efficacy is very conflicting here. So what we find is the psychological debriefing components may not improve recovery, and often can be harmful for some people who go through that process. And so what we found is that psychological debriefing can be useful for low stress exposure events, but it's really not recommended for the severe trauma or acute grief. And I'm talking about that debriefing, the psychological, that happens immediately after. That's not always good for people. So what should be done? So instead of having that whole debrief where people talk about what happened in the incident, talk about psychologically how they were feeling and really walking through that piece, what's really needed is very similar to what's needed for victims, but we find that that translates to first responders as well. So what we really need to do is promote safety, calm, connectedness, self-efficacy, group efficacy, and hope. So really doing a screening of where people stand psychologically, disseminating education about trauma, mental health resources, and referrals, rather than jumping immediately into that psychological treatment, which could happen during a debriefing session where people are actually talking about in detail what happened in the event. Improving the organizational morale. So we find across the board that social support in all settings is a very huge buffer to any type of victimization, and especially in mass violence incidents. So within first responders, that organizational morale really does take the place and serves as that social support piece, helping connect to other social support, both inside and outside the organization, and then monitoring recovery over time. Psychological first aid is a great resource for this debriefing, or for kind of psychologically what can happen right after an incident. It's an evidence-informed approach for assisting in that immediate aftermath, and it very much touches on all of those points that I talked about a minute ago. And I have a link here where you can have access to psychological first aid. And then what about later? So what we heard pretty much alarmingly across is that it doesn't always end in that response piece, which is what we find for victims in general and also first responders. So it's very important to assess and triage needs for ongoing mental and behavioral health, and be able to provide ongoing resources and activities through multiple different settings, but then also as time goes on and as the scene and as the incident response changes. Just a couple of things that we heard is that families very much with first responders, and Eugenia mentioned this at the beginning, we need to pay attention to families. One quote that we heard is one of the ideas was that we could get all the families together off duty so that people's wives, husbands, and girlfriends could get together and commiserate about what their significant other does. So what we heard from many first responders was that family members don't always know what their loved one is doing when they're on the scene or when they're at work, because it's not completely public. So unless they tell them, they don't always know these links or these the scenes that people are going into. But when a mass violence incident occurs, it's very public. So family members and community members know exactly what's happened, or at least what they're hearing on the news is what happened. And that can cause very significant impact. And then there's also this long-term impact. A couple of resources as we end. So one of our partners, the Police Executive Research Forum, or PERF as it's shortened, we developed a lessons from the field in collaboration with them. And it's a very great document. Here's the link to it, but it very much gives information on that role of police executives in assisting victims of mass violence, both victims in the community and also within their own first responder organizations. Another helpful resource, the National Fallen Firefighter Foundation, another one of our partners. We have a recommendations following mass violence incident rapid response guide. And this is for fire departments where it kind of walks through those different stages as far as planning, response, and recovery, and some suggestions for what to do. And then also IACP has a mass violence advisory initiative. The link is at the bottom here. We collaborate very closely with them. They provide peer-to-peer assistance to law enforcement leaders following a mass violence event. I actually had a meeting with them today, and they're starting to very much expand their services so that it's not only in the direct aftermath of a mass violence incident, but over, the months and years to come. So they're a great resource for how to assist following mass violence incident.
Thank you, Angie. What fabulous information and a great way to get this all started here. So I'm going to go ahead now and switch to Garnell Whitfield Jr., who is going to share with us his professional training and personal experiences.
Thank you. Yes. So having been a first responder for many years, we're taught to respond quickly and professionally to emergencies and to kind of separate ourselves emotionally from the persons and from the scene that we're responding to. To be strong, to not show weakness, especially, men. They have ego. They have a thing of being strong, and emotions are seen as something that of being weak. Once you leave the scene, you're taught to kind of put that away and get ready for the next call. You have to separate yourself and pack all of these things away. And people kind of see themselves through their work. First responders see themselves, they identify themselves as heroes, as persons who are above the fray, so to speak. Next slide. On May 14th, here in Buffalo, we had a mass shooting where my mother was murdered along with 9 other people in our community. It was a hate-motivated crime, and 3 other persons were physically wounded, but the entire community was emotionally devastated during that time. Next slide. This presented a specific challenge, a very different challenge for me, having been used to responding to emergencies and being leaned on by other persons and being helpful to other persons. On this particular day, I find myself as a victim, as a person in need and vulnerable, publicly vulnerable, for probably the first time in my life in this way. It was very disconcerting. I was the one that was, beside myself. I was the one that needed consoling. But even during that moment in time, people continued to come to me because they were used to seeing me in a position of leadership. And to some degree, that was helpful for me because I was able to fall back into that and put my personal feelings on the side on behalf of the community, on behalf of my family and others. This fact that this was a hate crime exacerbated pre-existing, things within my life as a Black person in America. This was a tough thing to deal with, to know that, a white supremacist had murdered people within my community, my own mother, in fact. And so this complicated things greatly because in my career as a Black person in the first response community, I've had to deal with these kinds of, racial and discriminatory policies and practices my entire life. And so this opened up, all of those things also. Next slide. Needless to say, having helped others in my career and not being able to help my mother, I have feelings of guilt. Now, I'm not naive and don't think that I could have stopped this from happening, but I still carry a certain amount of grief, certain amount of guilt associated with not being able to protect my mother. I wish I would have done more. What could I have done differently? All of those things come into my mind. I need to be strong for my family. I need to try to put on this facade of being in control and not losing it. Not being too angry, not being publicly out of control or whatever. So you put on these facades or whatever, and you try to be strong and you try to get through the moment. But at the same time, you're bearing the things that you need to be able to express, and that becomes a problem if you don't have that opportunity. Next slide. First responders should know, what first responders do know is that expression of your feelings, and that can be stigmatizing. It can label you as being weak or being not up to the task. But first responders need to know that it's okay not to have all the answers, that we are just human beings. We have to be able to find a balance in our life and our work and not completely identify as a person who runs in where others run out, a person who is above the fray, a person who is not impacted by the things that they face. Because the truth of the matter is that, at the end of the day, like I said, we're human beings. We need to be able to, as we compartmentalize things at work, as we put things on a shelf, or we separate ourselves from the incidents that we go to, the very same thing needs to happen in our personal life, where we don't necessarily bring these things home. We have to have a way to debrief. We have to have a way to kind of deal with these things so that it doesn't impact all of the rest of the things that are in our life, our family, our home, and other things. Helping to help, don't bow to the pressure of feeling that you have to perform all the time. It's okay to ask for help. It's okay not to be able to participate in certain aspects of your job and your profession. You have to take the time you need to recover it's very important that you do that. And just because you become a victim and you become a part of the problem when you don't do that. And so you have to learn how to say no, or, not at this particular moment. I'm not feeling like I can do this right now, or I need help. Those are things that are very important for us to be able to do. Next slide. And so in order to have that kind of a climate, it starts at the top. Leadership has to, develop a climate that encourages your team to seek help, that lets you know that it's okay, that you won't be judged. We have to not, expect things from people that they don't have, basically. We have to make sure that we're dealing with human beings and they are our most valuable asset. We have to protect them, be protective of them. Provide training opportunities about the correlation between emotional and physical weaknesses, physical wellness. We have to also be able to provide a safe environment, have readily identified resources locally and online, incorporate wellness into our trainings and routines. Again, these things start at the top. People take first responders for granted. We do our jobs and are declared heroes by many, but the truth of the matter, we're just human beings. We take care of the equipment, we have maintenance schedules and routines, we do training, but we don't do that for humans. Again, our most valuable asset. And this has to change. We must take better care of ourselves, and we must put ourselves first in all things. Next slide.
Thank you for sharing, and we are all just terribly sorry that you went through what you did, and wishing you and your family our deepest condolences. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Chief Mullen.
Thank you. And if you could just go to the next slide, please. Thank you all for allowing me to be a part of this very important conversation today. I know that as I saw, 2/3 of the audience has either responded or experienced a mass violent incident. It certainly is no surprise to you that any organization or community that goes through a crisis that involves mass fatalities or either mass violence certainly faces challenge that really exceed the daily operational capabilities of our organizations or even our communities. I first experienced this in 2007. I was the police chief in Charleston, South Carolina, when we had a mass fatality incident involving our fire department where 9 firefighters died in a warehouse fire. Clearly, the response, the long-term recovery that you've heard about already was a real impact on our community within the responder community, as well as the overall community, involved families and others that were connected with the fire department. So it was really important, and I learned during that event that it takes a lot of effort and a lot of resources and a lot of dedication to respond to that type of event because of the scope and the magnitude of it. And as we were building that capacity based on that incident, we were having to provide that support and that service simultaneously. I thought that would be the worst incident of my career, but I quickly learned 8 years later, one day prior to the 8th anniversary of the Sofa Superstore fire in Charleston, that would not be the case. I actually responded to a mass violence incident that occurred at Mother Emanuel, where 9 beautiful people were murdered because an individual wanted to start a race war. When I first got the call, I could not have imagined what would be occurring over the next 12 days and then 12 months as it related to my organization, to the city, to the state, and many, many others that were impacted by this tragedy. But what I did recognize when I got on the scene was that it was something that I had never comprehended. The sights, the sounds, the grief, the sorrow that was being displayed almost immediately by responders as well as community members that had gathered at that location was hard to fathom. And then when you have to face those families and the survivors and tell them that 9 of their loved ones had passed away in the church, and then face the small child that was in the back of that church who her father was killed. It was just one of those things that you never forget, and it has a lifelong impact on you. And people that have not been through these types of experiences, that's hard for them to understand. But most responders, as you've heard, not only have to deal with this really significant crisis trauma, but also the cumulative trauma that has occurred. So what I want to talk to you about today is how we prepared for this type of crisis. And I will tell you that as we move on to the next slide, the cultural aspect of the organizational preparation, I can't overemphasize, because what we learned from the Sofa Superstore fire in 2007 really reinforced the fact that this culture has to be maintained and reinforced on a daily basis. And that helped us inform our abilities as well as our training and the things that we did with our organization. It really helped us not only deal with the first responders, but also with the community when this happened. So you've got to have this culture in your organization that supports this mindset of asking for help as a strength, build capacity, and then embrace that we are vulnerable. Next slide, please. So doing this requires us to be constantly in motion in terms of creating opportunities for our individual officers and responders to be aware of what's going on around them, to get some reference points, to understand what they might be experiencing when they go into this situation, and having those really honest conversations that sets the stage of reality. What is it that I might feel? What is it that I might experience? How am I going to react when I see someone who has lost so much? And then building the capacity with your external partners so that when you do have one of these incidents that overwhelms your abilities, that you can have them immediately respond and start providing assistance. And that's through sharing experiences and sharing vulnerabilities. And again, just building that culture that helps support people to understand that it's okay to ask for help. Next slide, please. So what were some of the foundational things that I believe were really beneficial to our organization and our community, and I think could be beneficial to others, is clearly the internal actions that you take to help your organization go through the cumulative trauma events will strengthen you and cause you to have extended capacity through crisis. So internal peer support teams, providing training on crisis intervention, mental health first aid, all the things that your officers can utilize to build their resiliency so that when they face one of these situations, they've got some resources available. And then clearly reinforcement from the top. Leadership has to promote and reinforce the fact that asking for assistance is a positive thing and encourage that. Building the demonstration of support, showing people in the organization. Just because you have a peer support team doesn't mean that it's effective. You've got to let it grow, train, develop, utilize outside resources, give it the opportunity to share and go to places and be a part of things like post-critical incident seminars so they can bring those ideas and those tools back. And connecting with those local professionals, I think that's probably one of the most critical aspects of preparing yourself for this type of a crisis, where you have the short and long-term impacts that you're going to have to utilize different types of skill sets to help your people. For us, we had regional victim advocacy coalitions, we had regional chaplaincies, we had embedded mental health clinicians that we could reach out to immediately. We had partnerships with some of the special response resources within our state, as well as MUSC that we had partnered with and done training on homicide survivor seminars, as well as sexual assault. So we were familiar with those responders, and we have been able to build trust in them. So when they showed up on our scenes to start helping our responders in our community, they were not strangers. We knew their names, we knew who they were, we trusted them, and it was a lot more compatible for people to reach out to them immediately. So it's really important to start to develop those partnerships ahead of time and strengthen them, because those relationships will be critical, not only during the response itself, when we were able to get immediate surge capacity of those types of resources, but it was also long-term when we were going through memorials and vigils and trials and all of those types of things. Next slide, please. So for me, obviously, some of the things that were really important was being present, letting my people know that I was there, communicating with them, making deep connections, showing authenticity through vulnerability so that they knew that I was hurting just like they were. And I think that really allowed us to have some more deep connections, and then ask for that help and assistance and be willing to accept it. That's not always easy for individuals or for organizations, but in these cases, because of the relationships that have been built ahead of time, it's important to ask and accept for that. Next slide. So personally, I think anybody that's been through one of these mass violence incidents, it's a crucible moment. It really tests their character. It defines them. For me personally, I know that I started to have a much higher sense of this gratitude mentality because I had taken many things for granted. The little things often got past me. But during this period of time, I really started to recognize that the small things that people were doing, the connections that we had made, the willingness to reach out and provide just the smallest sense of support and services to the community, as well as other responders, checking on one another. All of that became very important to me. It helped me get through the process and recognize that even though we had a significant challenge and our community had been hurt at its core, that the responders that were coming out and providing that support to the community because they loved our community was very, very rewarding. And then we started to bring and embrace one another to support each other as we went through this, allowed us to look at what was the positive things that we could bring out of this horrific event that occurred for us. And I think that over the next 16 months, we did a lot of positive things with the Illumination Project and bringing together our community and using this horrible event to actually create and strengthen the relationships between the police department and the community and all the people that were involved. So it was really a way for us to use this trauma and this horrible situation and turn it into a positive. Next slide, please. So what did I learn? Adaptive capacity is really important for your individual responders as well as your organization. You've got to utilize opportunities that have already occurred to others or in your organization for training, for references, to build that capacity for resiliency through some kind of tool set and other resources that when they find themselves in this situation, it's not the first time. If you're planning all this and preparing and hoping that you're going to get through it when the crisis is occurring, then you will not be as successful as possible in terms of providing for your individual responders or for your community. Mandatory or voluntary participation in debriefings or counselings. You've already heard some about that. It's important to balance that. And that rolls right into what I think is also important for organizations to promote active bystandership. Everybody has a role in watching out for their brothers and their sisters in situations like this. If you see someone who is experiencing overwhelming trauma, they can't deal with their emotions, their personalities are changing, don't wait for someone else to step up and say something. It's important to encourage everyone to be involved. Be prepared for that long haul and designate a lead person to make sure that while you are focused on all of the external things that are happening and required of you, that there's someone within your organization, in our case, it was our peer support team, that was monitoring and making sure that the services and the support that our individual officers and our organization needed was not falling through the crack. And then finally, one of the things that I learned very early on, and I recognized, was that it's important to take care of yourself as a senior leader. It's also important to take care of your other leaders, as well as your peer support teams, because they're in the midst of all of this. They're seeing it all, they're experiencing it all. And if they don't have the resources and the support that they need, they could be really, really significantly impacted by this particular situation. So what I'd like to leave with you is this, as organizations or communities or individuals, if you have the ability to make major decisions, each day you should work to create a culture within your community or your organization that promotes individual and organizational capacities and understanding, so that your responders, the individual organizations, as well as your community can emerge from these crises with a focus of well-being, more resiliency, and a sense of hope for the future. And that's what we all want. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Mullen. That was fantastic information. I'm going to turn it over now to Mary Fetchit.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And it's just an honor to be here. And of course, with to be here with Garnell and Greg and all the wonderful work that they've done. Next slide. My name's Mary Fetchit, and I'm founding director of Voices Center for Resilience. On 9/11, our 24-year-old son, Brad, was murdered by terrorists. He was working on the 89th floor of the South Tower, which was the second tower to be hit, but the first to fall. When the plane hit the first tower, Brad called my husband at work and then left me a message at home. He was one of 2,977 that died at the 3 locations that day. 93 countries lost citizens. Brad's death was a catalyst for the work that we've continued to do at Voices. Next slide. At the time of 9/11, I was working at an outpatient mental health clinic as a clinical social worker. And shortly after the attacks, Beverly Eckert and I co-founded what was then known as Voices of September 11th. You know, our mission really hasn't changed. For over 22 years, we've provided long-term support for thousands of victims' families, responders, and survivors. The area that we've actually grown is really on preparedness and really taking what we've learned through our research, through working with the 9/11 community, to help other communities prepare for, respond to, and recover from acts of terrorism and mass violence. If you can go back, though, at the time, the U.S. was unprepared to respond to a tragedy of that magnitude. And I was living in Connecticut, but all of the decisions were being made in New York City. And we felt that we needed a seat at the table. The decisions they were making were directly impacting our families. So Beverly and I and other family members began attending meetings with elected officials in New York City and then Washington, D.C. And we really became outspoken advocates on a number of issues. First and foremost, we wanted a proper memorial built at the site. We worked with the medical examiner to develop a notification process for the families. We fought for the creation of the 9/11 Commission, which led to sweeping and intelligence reform, among other things. But more recently, working with the responders and survivors to make sure that they had the medical and mental health treatment that they needed and deserved. Next slide. So initially, after any tragedy, the focus is really on the victims' families and the injured survivors. Yet on 9/11, there were over 400,000 people that survived. They lived, worked, or went to school in the area. But within weeks, they returned to their homes and their businesses. Over 90,000 people responded and worked in the recovery effort at Ground Zero for 9 months. They searched for body parts, personal belongings, and, clearing the site so that they could begin the rebuilding process. So when you look at this slide, you see that responders go far beyond fire and police. At the site, there were steel workers, electricians, medical personnel, nonprofit organizations, volunteers, and a long list of others that worked in the recovery effort, either at Ground Zero or in some of the other related sites. And they were told at the time that the air was safe, but today they're suffering the consequences of those exposures. Next slide. While our staff was meeting with survivors and responders to document their stories, we recognized very early on that many were suffering from serious medical and mental health conditions. Yet it took 10 years and tirelessly advocacy of John Fiel and John Stewart and responders who themselves were suffering from life-threatening illnesses. Some may remember the NYPD officer Lou Alvarez testifying before Congress after he had had 68 chemo treatments, and he died just weeks after his testimony. So in 2011, the James Zadroga legislation was signed into law by President Obama, and the clinical centers of excellence were set up to provide medical and mental health treatment. Next slide. Today, over 77,000 are in treatment for one or more medical conditions. There's over 100 certified cancers that they qualify for, but a lot of respiratory problems and other life-threatening illnesses. 22,000 have a mental health diagnosis. So when you note on this chart, you can see among the medical conditions that anxiety disorders, major depression, and PTSD are in the top 10 certified conditions. Sadly, over 6,500, it's almost 6,600 now have died. It's double the number of deaths on 9/11, and those deaths are going to continue because of the conditions that they have. Next slide. So when you think about the phases of a community's psychological response, this is over the course of a year. But, these issues, when issues are unresolved, this cycle continues. And we've seen that over 22 years. We still have people calling us for the first time asking for assistance. But some of the things that really impact their well-being is the continued loss of life, the exposure to other tragedies, the ongoing trials and lawsuits that still, Guantanamo Bay is still going on, and then not having access to the resources that they need and deserve. Next slide. So after a traumatic event, it's normal to have symptoms of shock, grief, disbelief, problems concentrating, and other symptoms. But when these symptoms persist and it affects one's long-term daily functioning, it can cause strain on your relationships. The mental health conditions can cause physical symptoms. Of course, flashbacks are very, often persist. And then you have higher sensitivity and hyperarousal. Next slide. The stigma around mental health and seeking professional help is often prevalent among responders. And I was so thrilled to hear Greg talk about his leadership in really debunking the mental health stigma. But many responders are afraid of losing their job. If they work in law enforcement, they're afraid about not having a right to carry a weapon. And some of the dangers that indicate individuals should seek help is suicidal thoughts or self-harm, isolating themselves and not, conversing with their family and friends, sudden changes in weight, continued trouble sleeping, and then, of course, consumption of drugs and alcohol. And that a lot of that went on after 9/11. Next. These are some of the major mental health conditions, and I'll talk about a few of these, but I wanted to focus on the last three. So if you could go to the next slide. Burnout, compassion fatigue, and vicarious trauma can be prevalent among individuals working in law enforcement, fire services, victim services, emergency medical services, and other related professions. So working in an excessively stressful situation, witnessing deaths or near-death experiences, and that continued exposure to victims of trauma. You know, victims of trauma are not the easiest to get along, especially immediately after the event. And then, of course, exposure to other violent situations, you know, can exacerbate these conditions. So fire and police, like Greg talked about, have the advantage of being able to monitor the impact of cumulative exposures and to put systems in place, like he talked about, that both internal and external to set up preventative measures. Next slide. So this, and I apologize for, you know, a lot of content here, but this was a research project that was done with the World Trade Center responders from 11 to 13 years out. And you see on this first point that half of those that had PTSD in year one still have active PTSD at the time. Non-traditional responders and volunteers, like I talked about, people outside, you know, firefighters and responders, have a higher rate of PTSD. And I really think that's related to not having that network of friends that understand what they've gone through, and the peer-to-peer support networks and some of the things that can be offered by organizations. Retired officers have slightly higher rates versus active duty officers. And again, this goes back to not losing their network of friends that understand what they've gone through, and how that can impact them over the long term. Proximity to the disaster, long duration of work, you know, which is very difficult to, you know, to eliminate, especially immediately after an event, but the intensity of the exposure. And those that arrive early on the scene, and, you know, in many of these cases, it's not, you know, a trained personnel, it's the janitor or the principal or the, you know, the person that runs the shop or the mall where it occurred. But they have nearly 2 times the impact of PTSD. Traditional symptoms I'll talk about a little later, about the non-traditional. But then the rates of responders with PTSD, it's consistent with military, but I think military have a lot of more resources available to them through the VA. Next slide. So when you think about, you know, the recognizing PTSD, these are non-traditional symptoms of PTSD. So re-experiencing it, I talked about avoidance earlier, negative changes and beliefs and feelings. A lot of that's related to, you know, you felt safe, you know, on one day and you felt very unsafe on the next day. But then the hyperarousal, feeling keyed up, you know, aggressiveness, recklessness, destructive, self-destructive behavior, and hypervigilance. Next. Responders that are at high risk for mental health conditions, and yet they're often the last to seek help. So it's important, you know, as Greg talked a lot about, for leaders to set the tone and debunk the stigma around mental health. It's important to manage your workloads. As I mentioned, in the immediate aftermath, that's hard to manage because, you know, it's all hands on deck and you have much longer work hours. Leaders are able to identify signs of personal stress. I talked about vicarious trauma, burnout, and mental health conditions. It's important to provide the resources that Greg talked about for your employees to promote wellness and build resilience, and to establish those relationships in advance of a tragedy, within and without your organization, so that you have access to confidential mental health counseling, chaplains, and peer-to-peer support. And the collaboration really, I think, with trusted individuals is the key to success. Next. And one of my favorite quotes is that of from Katie Reed. And the quote is, "Self-care is giving the world the best of you instead of what's left of you." And I think all of us, can understand that and the roles that we play in helping the helpers. And but this is really an important thing to keep in mind, in your work and in your work with your staff and other individuals. So thank you for including me, and I'll turn it over.
Thank you, Mary. Really great information. And thank you to all the presenters and all of the really wonderful things that you shared, and also your bravery and sharing your stories with us. So thank you. So what we're going to do now is have each of our presenters share one strategy or skill that you hopefully can take away as something to try or think about when, trying to respond to first responders who are impacted by a mass violence incident. So Angie, I'm going to let you go ahead and start us off.
Yes, my take home is, in working with first responders, it's imperative that we think of them and consider them victims. So really consider the role that they play, and utilize available resources to help them to take care of themselves, just like we would other victims that are present at the scene.
Thank you. Garnell, can you share one strategy or skill takeaway?
Yeah, sure. I think it's important to, manage expectations, both organizationally and as individuals. I think that's very important, and to, again, set the tone for leadership at the top. I think it starts there. So thank you, Greg and Mary, and all for your wonderful comments.
Thank you. Chief Mullen.
Yes, ma'am. I really believe that, as been mentioned a couple of times here, developing relationships, not necessarily just within the first responder or public safety arena, is extremely important ahead of time. Mental health providers, external mental health providers, build coalitions around individuals like victim advocates and chaplains that can surge in and help you during these situations. And then also reach out to partners that are in the university settings and researchers. MUSC was a great partner for us and helped us build a lot of resource and capacity. And I think that was a really important thing for us, and other people should utilize that same opportunity.
Thank you. Mary.
I think the most important thing is to learn from others, to learn, through experiences, best practices, to develop those relationships in advance of a tragedy, to be prepared, and not wait for the tragedy to happen, but have those resources, have that training in place, and to be able to develop the collaboration with organizations within your own community. And now with Zoom, it can be worldwide.
Thank you. And if I could just take the liberty of a common thread I heard across all of these take-home messages was the importance of collaboration and connections, and remembering no one's alone, right? I mean, to be, quote, what we've heard so many times, it does take a village, and we're not on an island all by ourselves. So I think those are really critical things to take away from everybody's presentations, and I want to thank you all for that. Anybody who would like to request any kind of consultation or training or technical assistance from our center, we invite you to please email us. And the last thing we're going to do to wrap up today's town hall is to answer some questions. I do want to thank those of you who did submit questions in advance for our presenters, and I'm going to just throw out a couple that we pulled from the ones that we received. So the first question was, what is the best approach to encourage first responders to access or seek help in a manner that doesn't cause a fitness for duty concern or stigma? And Greg, I'm hoping you can answer this one for us.
Sure, thank you. Well, I think it goes back to developing the internal resources within your organization, clearly developing a peer support team of individuals that can be trusted, and then give them the ability to conduct that outreach um, through the leadership of the organization, reinforce the fact that you are allowing these peer support teams to provide as much confidential connection as possible, except in some very specific situations that are required reporters by law. But just allow that resource to be built, and then provide it the opportunity to build the trust and confidence in relationships within your organizations, and then create that bystandership mindset that everybody in the organization should be monitoring and reporting, or at least sharing information with the people that they see may be struggling, that it is okay to go ask for help, and it is not going to be a career-ending situation if you bring that forward and request it.
Thank you. Right. There is no stigma in seeking help. I really hear that. And I think that's a great message. Cornell, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I think Greg hit the nail on the head. Again, it starts with leadership, creating a culture that says it's okay to seek help. It's okay to ask for help, and you have to build trusted relationships within the organization as well as outside of the organization. So bringing in those persons from outside, the clergy, counselors, and others, and building that relationship prior to an event, I think is most important.
Thank you. The next question we had is, what types of support and services are recommended or provided to families of first responders after mass violence incident to help them and to strengthen their capacity to help loved ones? Angie, it sounds like in your wheelhouse here.
Yes, definitely. I don't know that there are a lot of developed services and supports. I think there should be. A big piece, I think, is that knowledge and education. So letting family members and close friends and people who are surrounding first responders understand that they may be experiencing some of these trauma symptoms, and they may have safety concerns and anxiety and fear, just like a loved one of any other victim from an incident would have. And then really building up that support and community. So understanding that, a lot of the quotes that we heard and a lot of departments that we've talked to have really talked about the value and the strength in having family members and friends of their loved ones who are first responders coming together and building support from one another, because they each kind of understand what the others are going through.
Uh-oh, it looks like you froze, Angie.
Support.
Okay, I think we had a freeze at the end there. So
Oh no.
Yeah, your last couple of sentences we did miss. So. But thanks, Angie, appreciate it. We had one final question about how can service providers anticipate and best understand the needs of first responders after a mass violence incident, and to build effective responses into our planning efforts? Mary, it sounds like this is a good one for you. You're on mute, Mary.
I think I've said it before, much like Greg talked about. I mean, he had one tragedy, dealt with, and he learned by it. So it's really learning from people that are working in the field, building those relationships in advance. But what you do at the beginning really has a long-term impact. And so I would say that immediate response is critical. And to do it right, you really have to have the training, you have to understand the culture, you have to have the resources, you have to have the relationships in advance, and so I think that it boils down to that.
Thank you. I want to make sure that I share with all of you the some of the website links here to some resources from the Office of Victims of Crime, the National Mass Violence Center, where Angie and I are located, where Mary is, PERF, and some other places as well. So these will all, again, be available to you. You'll get these resources. The other thing I really want to encourage all of you to do is to please take a moment to do our evaluation. We really value your feedback and your comments, and we do apologize for any technical difficulties that we had today. Again, we'll make this available to all of you. And we do hope you will share your thoughts and any suggestions you might have for future town halls. And also want to put a plug in there that we do have another town hall scheduled for February. It's actually February 22nd, and the topic will be trauma across the lifespan. So let me just again extend a huge thank you to our wonderful speakers, Mary Fetchit, Gregory Mullen, Angie Moreland, and Garnell Whitfield Jr. Really appreciate all the wonderful information you shared. And thanks to all of you who have participated in today's town hall. So don't hesitate to reach out if there's any information or resources we can provide to you. Thank you very much.